Welcome. I'm Ron Luskin, and I'll be your host and moderator for tonight's webinar. Thank you for being in our audience this evening. At last check, we had over 400 registrations. Wow. I'd imagine within the audience we have people at different stages or different places on the spectrum of considering racism in our city and country, in one's own position related to anti-racist behavior. Wherever you are on that spectrum, we welcome you and thank you for your presence this evening. As I began to plan and organize this webinar, I reached out to many people, white people and people of color, seeking advice. I asked questions to learn, I listened, and I reflected. If I've erred in some way, in any way, I'm sorry. However, I do hope you'll participate tomorrow in the evaluation sent to everybody and let us know what I could have done better or what we could do better should we attempt this again. Before introducing the panel, I want to create some expectations for you about the topics to be covered this evening. There are a variety of broad topics we will be exploring: relationship building, anti-racist parenting, the workplace and workplace culture, what it means to do the work, your spheres of influence, and distributing our resources, whether that may be our time, our talent, or our treasure. Let me introduce the panelists for this evening. First, we have Sarah Alvarado, co-owner, Alvarado Real Estate, a self-described entrepreneur and co-conspirator. Marcus Brower, professor of psychology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Michelle Heitzinger with the Urban League, and Robin Langton, Director of Population Health at UW Health. We're going to go till about 8:05, 8:10 this evening with our panel discussion, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. This panel format is an opportunity for these individuals to share their experiences for you to find something of relevance to you, to learn from their action, and then apply it in some way to your own life and future actions. I believe it is incumbent upon us to be a part of the solution by learning some new behaviors from one another. I was asked, why just white people talking to each other today? Well, we feel it may be an opportunity to create greater receptivity, to hear what you hear and learn what you can from the experiences of other white people. Because for the past many years, we've heard about the segregation, the systematic racism, and the achievement gaps in Madison and in Wisconsin. We have for years heard from members of the Black community encouraging us to heed their concerns. Members of the Black Leadership Council have spoken. They have tried to communicate to us in the white community about what to do. We've heard from Reverend G, Judge Mitchell, Reuben Anthony, Michael Johnson, Lisa Payton Kerr, Vanessa McDowell, and many others. Some say their pronouncements have fallen on deaf ears. Allow me to offer this quotation from Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. People of color, including W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, have been writing about whiteness for decades, if not centuries. These writers have urged white people to turn their attention onto themselves, to explore what it means to be white in a society that is so divided by race. Close quote. So now is the time for other white people to help us understand what they've done and how we can apply it to our own situation and our own behavior. Let's listen and learn and see what we can do differently beginning tomorrow. I'm going to begin with Michelle. Michelle Heitzinger is, I believe, the only person on our panel who's a native of Madison, grew up on Madison's South Side. Tell us a little bit about what your experience was growing up in Madison, Michelle. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, everybody, for logging on tonight. I want to start by sharing that it's a lifelong process to unlearn racism, and it's nothing you're going to do overnight, and you're going to make mistakes. And secondly, this is my experience, and it's not to infer what I experienced will or will not transfer to other people. And building relationships is also personal, but Ron has asked me to share my experience, and here's what I know. So for some geographical perspective, my neighborhood was Penn Park to the back gate of the Coliseum. So South Park Street to Rusk Avenue. And for historic perspective and giving away my age, I lived there from 1964 to 1980 before I left for college. My dad sold the house about 1995. I didn't have a choice in where my parents bought a house, and they didn't consciously seek this neighborhood out in 1964. My 81-year-old dad shared with me that he and my late mom bought the house there because that was the neighborhood they could afford. They had a union carpenter salary and his veterans loan. He was a carpenter for the university's service building on campus, and he had been in the Navy. It was a working class neighborhood, predominantly African-American homeowners, lots of kids, and my mom was one of a couple of stay-at-home moms who not only kept her eye on us 5 kids, but a lot of the other kids in the neighborhood. We were the house that had everybody's spare key inside of a cabinet that had hooks on it that my dad had put. So if somebody got locked out, they knew to come to our house to get their spare key. And again, while I didn't have a choice in living there, I'm so glad I did. Like anybody who has the benefit of growing up in an integrated neighborhood, you are more enlightened as a human. And a couple of cultural differences that I completely embraced was soul music and the beloved Jackson 5. My parents listened to country music. So I learned to dance from my friends and soul food. And I learned that collard greens are delicious and chitlins are not, and not all Black families eat chitlins. Like all of us, you usually don't understand the significance of your neighborhood until somebody points it out. I had a friend in high school whose parents didn't like her driving me home because of where I lived. They were white. And you don't forget the sting of that and the embarrassment. All of these experiences shape your vision of the world, though, and I'm more comfortable around people of color than I am white people because the only shame I've ever felt was from white people. So here I am, about 40 years later, back on my beloved South Side, working at the Urban League and doing what I can to support the racial reckoning that we're all dealing with right now. Thank you.
Talk a little bit, Michelle, about your experience with those families, and probably what I think you shared with me previously is the similarities of families in your neighborhood.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody wants the same thing for their kids. They wanted good schools. They wanted them to behave. They yelled at their kids the same way my mom yelled at me. And we were in and out of each other's homes. So everybody had furniture the same as we did. And it was a very, looking back, very socioeconomic balanced neighborhood. Nobody had a great house. We were all kind of the same. And so, there wasn't a lot of differences except for when their cousins would come or when they had other family gatherings that were different from what I experienced in my house and with our white family. But it was basically the same.
And having been here in Madison for all these years, I'm sure you have many lifelong friends that you're still acquainted with, you're still involved with.
Yeah, and people that come and go from the Urban League, stopping in for things, meeting with Ruben, people that have stayed around or still in Madison, maybe not necessarily on the South Side. And the other part of it is people that know they know that you understand it. I've had my Black friends say, I know you're not Black, but you're soul cultured. And I really take that to heart. I really find that a badge of honor because I understand their world and I can come and go out of it as I need to.
Help us a bit about how we can apply what you said. You understand their world. What is it that some of the rest of us can learn from you about that?
I guess, Ron, turn it around. Like, put any other ethnicity in there. What if it's an Asian neighborhood you lived in? What if it's a Hispanic neighborhood you lived in? What if it was a Middle Eastern neighborhood you lived in? You respect what's important to them and what's cultural to them. And again, trying to understand and learn a little bit more about it. You know, having attended the YWCA's Racial Justice Summit the last few years, one of the sessions I sat through is Black people aren't just white people that have color to them. There is a difference. And it's just kind of understanding some of those differences. And again, I don't know how you teach that. I think it's learned. It's having Black friends. It's listening to your Black girlfriends talk about things that they're bummed about. It's learning that your Black girlfriends actually go tanning. And I didn't know that. And so when I said, why are you, and it's to even out their skin tone if they were bridesmaids in somebody's wedding or what have you. And that was such a big eye opener. And to be able to be comfortable enough with your friends that you can go, what? You go to the tanning booth? And you know, that kind of stuff. It's, again, experience, and it's just learning from each other.
Sure. Thank you for sharing. Robin, wanted to ask you about a defining moment for you when you started to think about what it would mean to be an anti-racist parent.
Yeah, I can think of two examples. The first is that my family moved to Madison from Los Angeles in October of 2013, which is the same month the Race to Equity report came out. And we moved here because we had friends who lived here, and people had told us it was one of the best places to live in the country. And then we got here and that report came out, and it really showed that there are two Madisons. You know, it was the best place for white people and the worst place for Black people. And then really soon after that, a report about children from the Annie E. Casey Foundation came out, and it rated Wisconsin as the worst place in the country for Black children. And I thought, what have we done? We moved here because we wanted a better life for our son, and what is he going to be exposed to, and what's going to happen here? And really, should we have moved? And so that was when I really started getting more actively involved on an anti-racist journey. But the other moment was when my son came home from kindergarten. So he'd been in kindergarten for about 3 weeks or a month, and he made a list. And the list was good kids and Black kids. And he put every single Black boy in his class on the bad kids list, including his friends. And it just was a punch to the gut for me to realize, you know, we are all swimming in racism. And unless I am doing something proactive, he is going to be a perpetrator, and he is going to absorb these messages. So it was really personal to me to do something actively in my parenting.
So tell us a little bit about what the things you've done. I think that you mentioned that you got involved in an organization, Families for Justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was able to connect with Families for Justice, which is a network of people organizing against white supremacy. It started because I went to a workshop about how to talk to your kids about race and racism. And through that experience, I really got some great tips and tools on things like using books, you know, having books with people with different skin color, talking about skin color, talking about race with my kids, and just practicing and being proactive and not just waiting for things to come up or for them to say something. And then through that also, I became more involved in taking action, and he's been part of that as well. So things like being involved with the efforts with Freedom Inc. to remove the police from schools. He knows if I'm writing a letter to the school board or to other elected officials, or if I'm going to a meeting, I talk to him about why, and you know, what does safety look like for you? What would you do with $400,000 for your school? So we have those kinds of conversations all the time.
So what you're saying is when you choose to be an advocate, you're sharing that experience with your son.
Absolutely, or if I'm upset. So even the most recent things with George Floyd being killed, he would know if I was upset. And before, I might not have talked about it, but I do talk about it, and I'll say why I'm upset and how that's impacting me, and explain to him what's going on.
You know, I'm sure that this evening, among our 400 registrations, we have a few parents and perhaps even some grandparents in our audience tonight. So talk a little bit more about what you said were some resources. Are such resources available at the Madison Public Libraries? Are there some bookstores that you might frequent where you find some of these resources available to you?
Yeah, I think we're lucky in some ways that there are so many resources available. One of the things we use at the Madison Library, they have a whole section called We Need Diverse Books. And that's a list you can look up from the library too. And you can get books with pictures of people from all different backgrounds. We've also bought books from A Room of One's Own and read those together. And so that's kind of an easy way to get started, I would say, is just even looking at your bookshelf. My youngest, I think also not every book has to just be about skin color, but think about the representation. My youngest son is obsessed with wrestling, so we have a book called Lucia the Luchadora. Just think about different kinds of books and things that you can have in your house, but also where you go. We intentionally choose to go to West Town Mall to play, to go to the zoo to play, given that we know that racial inequities here are also often really tied to class. When we choose to go places that are free and accessible, we encounter families from more diverse backgrounds.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Sarah, I think you had an experience that you wanted to share with us in your own approach to anti-racist parenting.
Yeah, so I'm similar to Robin in terms of the timing. When I had my moment, I guess you could say, it was the week that I saw the Race to Equity report come out in September of 2013. I saw the presentation at a luncheon on a Tuesday. And just for a little bit of background, I'm a white woman, also raised in Madison, Wisconsin. Go Regents. I had to throw that out, Michelle. And so I met my husband, Carlos, in Mexico, and he's Native Mexican. So we're raising bilingual, multicultural children. And at the point when the Race to Equity came out in 2013, Alex, my oldest son, was 12, and then I had a younger son who was 9. So my kids were pretty old, and I was still, I would say, colorblind in terms of I was raised by hippie parents who really encouraged me to love whoever I wanted to, and that we're all the same inside. So it was a beautiful way to be raised in that I could love anyone I wanted, but I wasn't taught that we aren't treated all the same. So I did not grow up seeing my whiteness, understanding privilege, and understanding how prevalent racism is all around. And Carlos and I were, living our lives and very involved with the Latino community, but not seeing the two cities that people talk about, or the two rivers, I think, in Madison, in terms of what it's like as in the Black community in Madison versus the white community. So on Saturday, my son was at a soccer game, and they played, they won. At night, we're sitting at dinner, and he's telling me about the goals he saved. And he was like, and then at one point, Brian, who was brown-skinned, he was the sweeper, he kicked it out far. And Alex told me that someone on the other team yelled, "I hate Mexicans." And my son is light-skinned, which is relevant to the story. So he said this, and I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, Mom, but it was fine. We just wanted to play soccer. Brian didn't care. And I was like punched in the stomach. Like, what do you mean Brian didn't care? Like, what about you? I didn't say that. I just, I was trying to play that cool parent, and I was just listening. So we ended the conversation kind of quickly. Alex could tell that I was upset, but not too upset. And that night, my husband and I just had a really long conversation. Like, I was like, I am not raising my children the way I thought I would. I don't know what, this isn't okay. I don't really understand what's going on. And so it took me a couple of months, and I went to the YWCA Racial Justice Summit literally a month and a half later because of that, the Race to Equity report coming out and that situation with my son. And for me, it was realizing that it wasn't about how I was parenting him. It was who I was in the world, and that I wasn't having these conversations at our dinner table. He wasn't hearing me, like Robin said, get upset about things because I didn't see. I wasn't opening up my life to what was really happening, which is embarrassing to say. Like, let's be clear. It's just, I think a lot of people think, oh, you're married to a dark-skinned man, you must understand racism. No, no, I would say I've had a lot to learn since 2013. It's been quite the journey. And now Alex teaches me stuff. Like, our whole family has kind of switched, and he's amazing. And both my children are amazing. So that's kind of been some of my...
So what I'm hearing you say is you took a proactive effort yourself, just the way Robin described.
Yeah. But instead of it being, how do I parent differently? How do I parent so that my children can be anti-racist? I needed to realize that I needed to be anti-racist, and that children learn by modeling, right? So I think that whole conversation can go both ways. Like, I think my children were the ones that inspired me, so that's great. But at the same time, I got to do the work.
And I think I want to go back because a couple of you have mentioned you said you attended a YWCA Racial Justice Summit.
Yes.
They're typically held when?
In October.
All right. So.
And they also have YWCA the YWCA also has a series, which is very impactful. It's like 100, 200, 300. And I recommend all and any education that you can get from the YWCA.
So from those in our audience, they ought to go to the YWCA website and see about that summit, because it quite likely will be conducted virtually.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And Robin, I think you mentioned one or two organizations I want people in our audience to perhaps take note of.
Yep. Families for Justice is a great one if you're a parent, to follow on Facebook or check out the website. And then I did a series through Groundwork that is usually offered in the fall. That's a 6-week series for white folks who are looking to understand history but also move to take action. And I've also...
That's called Groundwork?
Groundwork. Mm-hmm. And then there's also a course that's been offered more frequently from Justified Anger, Black History for a New Day, that I've heard lots of positive things about too.
Great. And before I forget, Michelle, I think you referenced the Urban League has their own program maybe coming up soon. Is that correct?
Not specific racial justice. We've got a drive-through barbecue coming up. That's a voter registration, early registration census information on August 29th that we're encouraging people that need help with that. But yeah, we're a workforce and training entity, so that's what we're doing.
And Michelle, what did you want to comment about as it relates to your own experience with parenting? So I'd imagine, given your experiences, you've conducted your own anti-racist parenting with your children.
Yeah, my husband and I have many multiracial friends and couples, and Zoe was raised, our daughter was raised with all of their kids and our friends, and she ended up, she did Leopold, Cherokee West, and the UW, and graduated double majoring in social work and African American studies. And she's taught me and even my husband a lot that she's learned over the years too. You're never too old to learn and to understand things. And so she, again, being at West, I love West, very multicultural. Her friend group was multicultural. It was just, it was a great, we had a great experience with the Madison Public Schools, and having her at those different locations. It was, that was her friend group.
Thank you. We're going to move to Professor Brower, who's given me permission to call him Marcus. So Marcus, there again, amidst our 400 people this evening, I'm sure there are many people who are either employees or people in management positions who've been involved with diversity training in the workplace. Either they've been involved with it, they've helped plan it. And I guess what I'd like you to talk about, because I think it's an eye-opener for me when I heard you the first time speak to the fact that you believe from your research that perhaps the majority or a good proportion of the diversity training that's conducted may be ineffective.
Yes, the diversity domain is sort of special, right? If you look at other domains, evaluation plays a really important component. So we certainly want our drugs to be tested in randomized controlled trials. Every policy has an evaluation component built in. We want evidence-based teaching practices, but there's sort of one domain where we just do stuff, and that's the diversity and inclusion domain. There's been traditionally very little evaluation of effectiveness, and that situation has changed in the last 5 or 10 years. So there are now more and more rigorous evaluation studies coming out. And it actually turns out that many pro-diversity and pro-inclusion initiatives are either ineffective, and some are even counterproductive in the sense that they produce the opposite effect. They create a less inclusive climate. They lead to a situation where fewer women and fewer ethnic underrepresented groups are in leadership positions. So,
say that again. That's a really important point.
Some pro-diversity initiatives and some pro-inclusion initiatives can be counterproductive in the sense that they have the opposite effect of the effect that is being sought and desired. And this is why I think it's so incredibly important to find out what works and what doesn't work. And I do that in my research lab at the university. There are many colleagues across the country. It's sort of a growing field of diversity science. And these are people who use rigorous scientific methods to show what works and what doesn't work. And we have the relevant outcome measures, I mean, from climate surveys, the extent to which people feel included, the extent to which they feel welcome, the extent to which they report being the target of discrimination. But then we often have hard outcomes as well. We look at grades, we look at turnover, we look at number of sick days, we look at the achievement gap in educational setting, etc. So we now know that it's possible to go ahead and evaluate diversity and inclusion initiatives. And somewhat surprisingly, some of them that are traditionally used and actually used by a lot of companies actually turn out to be ineffective and sometimes
So
even
if you could, and if somebody's been either involved in a training or maybe about to be in a training or is planning a training, could you give us an idea about what some of the attributes are that may lead to ineffectiveness?
Yeah, many of these trainings involve blame, and blame doesn't really work very well with people of our target audience. So I refer to the target audience as people whose attitudes and behaviors we want to change, right? And our target audience is not the super egalitarian individuals. It's also not the super racist. It's probably the people in the middle, individuals who have either neutral or slightly negative attitudes towards underrepresented groups or particular underrepresented groups. These are the people whose attitudes and behaviors we want to change. These are the people who we want to get to behave in a more inclusive way on a daily basis. And the blame doesn't go over too well with them. So anything that starts out with blame is probably not the right approach. Another thing that is problematic, many of these diversity training efforts sort of talk about implicit bias and how widespread discrimination is. Sometimes that actually can be counterproductive. We now know that talking about implicit bias actually makes people believe that perpetrators of discrimination are less responsible for their behaviors. It also gives people the feeling that it's less under their control. It's not something that they can influence, not even in their own behavior. And then sort of if it's widespread, the message is very often, oh, everybody does it. So, I mean, if you do it as well, then it's probably not too bad because everybody else does it as well. Even though if it's then sometimes followed by, hey, this is bad and this should change. So, but sometimes the communication that discrimination is basically the norm and lack of inclusion is the norm gives people sometimes the license to perpetrate these same behaviors.
So on the flip side then, what have you found are some of the attributes that bring about the better outcomes, the beneficial outcomes to diversity training and enhancing the workplace culture? What are the things that people should be looking at from their diversity training?
There are certain types of diversity trainings that give people specific advice, specific answers of how they should monitor their behavior, what kind of thought processes or monitoring processes they should engage in. There are specific behaviors that signal inclusion, that signal welcoming, and that therefore give people concrete behavioral advice. Some of the diversity training sort of just said, hey, go out and be less biased. Well, that doesn't really help anybody. The more concrete the advice, the more specific the kinds of behaviors that we want people to engage in, the more likely they actually are to engage in.
Can you give me a couple examples of those behaviors, please?
Yeah, showing interest, asking people how their weekend was, finding out about their family, asking them what kind of terms they find offensive, what kind of terms to avoid. Asking them what actually is it that bothers them, that makes them not included, that makes them not feel welcome, and then making an active choice to avoid these behaviors. Try to learn how to pronounce people's names. Try to find out what they are interested in, and try to not mix up two individuals who belong to the same socio-ethnic group and mix up their names. So there are many behaviors, but I guess the number one advice that I was given, why not ask people, what are the kind of behaviors here in this company that make you feel unwelcome? And then on the opposite, what are the kind of behaviors that I can do that will show you that I care about you, that I respect you, and that make you feel welcome, and that will enhance your sense of belonging? Asking people goes a very long way. Go ahead.
And for those people who are in perhaps higher level management positions that are in our audience tonight, what are the kinds of things that management can do within their corporate culture that creates the right environment for the right outcomes to occur?
I regularly give talks to business owners, often organized by chambers of commerce. It's a 45-minute talk. It's hard to summarize that. I did summarize it in a resource document that is made available. There's a link in the resource document that will be distributed to participants of tonight's event. One of the key things here, I would say, is for many, many years, the focus was on diversity. How do we allow people of underrepresented groups to have access to the company? And how can we eliminate discrimination in hiring and promotion? That is incredibly important, and I don't want to at all say that this is not important, but more and more companies are now moving, saying, hey, there's a second component that is just as important as that one, and that is inclusion. How do we make sure that people don't leave? How do we make sure that people feel welcome and like to come to their job and like to do their job? And if they don't feel welcome, they will leave to the competitor. And the big companies, they have recognized that for a very, very long time, because the last thing that they want is their highly qualified engineers who are either women or who belong to underrepresented ethnic groups, that these people leave and go to the competitor. That's the last thing that they want. So actually, big companies, including multinational companies, have stepped up already 10, 15, 20 years ago, their efforts. What can we do to create an inclusive work climate? So I would say not just focus on discrimination, access, recruitment, discrimination and recruitment, but also promoting inclusion. What can we make sure that people feel welcome and respected and don't leave?
Thank you. So Sarah, I'm going to pivot to you in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to remind people, Marcus had indicated that there's a couple documents that he's made available. And when you receive the evaluation tomorrow, you'll be able to have a link to those documents, as well as some other resources that others on the panel have provided. But Sarah, I wanted to turn to you because you realized in your own business, Alvarado Real Estate, that you needed to take a new approach to how you conducted your business. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
So after I started doing my own work in 2013, I started getting pretty involved in the community. I helped co-found Step Up Equity Matters in the Workplace, and I was pretty out there, I guess you could say, in terms of my community work. And at one point, and I had stopped selling real estate actively around 2015, and I was managing and running the company with my husband and doing the coaching. And we had a position open, and one of the women that applied was someone that I knew from my racial justice circle in Madison, someone I had met. And she started working there as a transaction coordinator. And about 6 months in, she said, Sarah, can we have a honest conversation, like friend to friend? And I was like, yeah, of course. And she said, I see you doing all this work, and I see you really, out there with almost with anti-racist activities, actions, etc. But your company, it's pretty non-racist. And she didn't say those exact words. This is how in looking back. So for me, non-racist is we're not doing anything wrong. We're helping people. We don't hurt anybody. And then in terms of what would it look like if our organization, kind of like how I was, like before I had my awakening, if you will, I was non-racist, if anything. And then I started to actively become anti-racist. And she was like, your company is not what I thought it would be. And I was obviously like, okay, I can hear this because I'm learning racial resiliency, meaning that when we're going to have a hard conversation, I'm going to be resilient and I'm going to not crumble. So I didn't crumble, and she worked with me for about a year, and we did a lot of education and learning. So that's where back last fall is when we restructured the company basically to be much more committed to exploring and challenging the ways racism is embedded in real estate as a whole. And that, there's a lot that comes with that. So I don't know how many details you want, but it's been a major transition for us, and it hasn't been easy, but it's definitely what we want to be doing.
Well, I guess what I'd like to probe about, though, is, so what were some of the things that your coworker or friend told you that were indicative of the fact that perhaps you had a racist culture, or that you were perpetuating the racism within the real estate industry? What were a couple of those things that people in our audience could take away that maybe they would see in their own business situation?
Part of it is not even having conversations about it. So we wouldn't even talk about where it's hard to see what you can't see. So I wasn't reading books about it. I didn't, The Color of Law changed my perception greatly. So I don't know how to tell other people what they can do. I can just really say what I did. But when I started to realize the history of real estate, which is what I hadn't been taught, that helped me see how it was potentially part of today. So there is discrimination in real estate. There are, there's biases. There's ways that people of color are consistently, there's barriers to accessing homeownership, to accessing careers in real estate, to getting home loans. So like it's happening, and we were like, oh, well, we're just doing our thing to make it easier, but we weren't actively looking for ways to eliminate the barriers, figuring out ways to educate the community better, or with the other realtors, or the real estate industry as a whole. There's a lot of things, just in terms of the social justice trainings that we now prioritize. They didn't exist. Like we didn't have them. We were too busy. Everyone was busy.
So perhaps the learning that other people can take away from this is, whether you're in the architecture business or accounting or advertising, whatever the case may be, one needs to perhaps examine the history and the culture of those industries and do some examination about what is it that's prohibiting people of color from being there and from moving up.
Yep. All of that, Ron.
Yeah. All right. Michelle, wanted to just have you make a quick comment about, so you're I believe as you work at the Urban League, you're in the minority, and what do you see in the culture there that has been a nature of warmth and hospitality directed towards you?
I think because everybody's there for the same purpose, and that's to make sure that we're connecting in the community. There, obviously, because it's the Urban League, I feel like it's more woke than a lot of other businesses. There's a great camaraderie with our staff, and especially with we as women. Sarah, you alluded to that as well, that there's just, I think, a dialogue that can happen more freely and naturally, women to women. But it's, I've never not felt comfortable there. If anything, I feel like, you know, having more Black people on staff, we have it's probably about half white, half Black that works there. And probably because it's the nature of Madison, we're very, very white. And so it's a great place to be an employee. And again, a lot of that too comes from management on down. Marcus, when you talked about in these companies too, we have a grant that we're working with companies. We can get people into the companies. We can't get them advancing in the companies, people of color. And how as a company do you look at trying to nurture and grow the talent that you have there so that they don't leave because they don't feel welcome? So, you know, again, Brian, I'm getting a little off subject with that, but, you know, it's, again, that workforce culture that you cultivate, and that, you know, you're there for that purpose of all working towards that goal. And again, I just think especially my Black sisters, they're just so much more real than white people are when we talk to each other. And so we're able to have that camaraderie.
Marcus, I just wanted to come back to you for a last word that you might offer on this subject before we might move on.
I think I work with bigger companies, and I think in bigger companies, it is absolutely essential to first test out a new pro-diversity initiative at a small scale and to see if that particular diversity initiative works in this particular culture of that company. Every company has a different culture. Every company has different problems. In some companies, it is what happens on the factory floor, the blue-collar workers, how they talk to each other. In the next companies, it's the middle and upper management that has problems. So clearly identify what the problems are, who is perpetrating and contributing to these problems, and that's, again, your target audience. What actually the problems are. Is it lack of exclusion? Is it how information flows in the company, et cetera? And then what we do, in addition, we think a lot about what we call barriers and benefits. That is to say, what currently prevents members of our target audience from engaging in the behaviors that we want them to engage in? And what are the motivators or the kind of things that I could say to members of our target audience, to these same people, that would make it likely that they will change their behaviors? I think there are a lot of old approaches to behavior change. Oh, if we just inform people, they're going to go ahead and change their behaviors. This is old and outdated. We now know that information and awareness raising are very often not enough to change people's behavior. We have to go further. We have to understand what the barriers are and what the benefits are, and then specifically target those with and what that involves is knowing very well the target audience, and that involves probably talking to them. How come you're currently not engaging in these behaviors? What prevents you from doing that? And this kind of systematic approach, which is then tested at a small scale before it is implemented at a large scale, is likely to be much more effective than some canned diversity training that's applied to every single company, and it's the same for every company.
Thank you. Robin, haven't spoken with you for a few minutes, so let's come back to you, and you got to unmute yourself. We want to take a minute or two and talk about this idea of doing the work. You know, I think we've heard this expression that white people, we need to do the work, and whether that may be learning about the history of slavery, Reconstruction, learning about Jim Crow laws, Voting Rights Acts, the various aspects of racial history. What's one of the most effective things that you've done to do the work? And what could you recommend to other people in terms of doing the work?
It's a great question. So I told my 8-year-old I was going to be on this panel, and I said, I'm talking to white people about what we can do about racism. What ideas do you have? And he said, or do you think we can do anything? He said, you can do lots of things. First of all, speak up when you see racism. So I think part of it is awareness, you know, putting your eyes on and your attention on noticing when you see racism. And then just a simple thing, we watched this Sesame Street special about racism recently, and the tips were learn about it, talk about it, act on it. And I really think that's what it is. Do your own learning. Don't put the onus on people of color to teach you. You can do that. Talk to other people and with other white folks to do your processing, but then act, you know, build relationships, show up, be present, and follow the leadership of people of color. So, I mean, I think really it's get started. You know, there are lots of things you could do, but do something, whether your sphere of influence is home or a workplace or a spiritual community, get started.
Michelle, do you have a suggestion for the audience about what it means to do the work?
Yeah, I have to tell you that I have fatigue, and I'm a white person. With all that's going on, I can't imagine what it really is like inside the skin of my Black friends, and especially my boss, Dr. Ruben Anthony. You know, this is something that's been part of their world for all these hundreds of years, for over 400 years. And again, back to Robin's point, and I've learned this through my daughter too, talking to people and kind of pointing out that you really shouldn't say that. It really is a learned skill to be able to speak up or correct people without, again, back to Marcus's point, offending people or placing the blame. But maybe saying you might want to not use that because that could be hurtful to somebody. I know that even in my own family, my sister had reposted something that it wasn't really her belief thing. And her daughter, my niece, said, Mom, I identify as a liberal. Don't put down liberals. And, you know, just even being able to talk to your own family about certain things that you have to be careful what you say. It's hard and it's a skill that has to be learned. But even if it's just saying, hey, we gotta think of a different way to talk about that or to say that, but then you don't want to shut somebody else down for what they might be thinking or feeling. But it's important right now, more than it's ever been.
So I'm hearing you say that you need to call people out in the moment, because I've heard somebody say to me once before that silence is acquiescence or silence becomes complicity.
Yeah, and if you're in a group and it's maybe not the time, call them or text them and say, hey, can I just talk to you about something? I don't think you should have said that, or that could have been offensive to someone. And so it's, you know, we're walking different paths right now. And because of all the things that we've all seen, whether you're trying not to watch the news or you're an avid news watcher like my husband and I, this is the time. There's never going to be another time that's better than this, that you have to speak up and you have to read. So as we're going to give you guys stuff later, oh, that's my bookmark. There's really good materials out there now. There always has been, I guess, if you were an information seeker, there's really some great stuff and quick reads, and it has kind of working scenarios that you can learn from, and we'll get to that later, but you know, book clubs are a great way to get things started and get conversations started.
Marcus, do you have one idea for the audience? You're muted.
Sorry about that. There are great resources out there. What I find interesting in thinking about this whole topic is when you talk to members of what we call the target audience, it is interesting what they tell us, because they have particular beliefs that we may not share, but it is nevertheless important to know what people believe. So if you go in certain areas of the country, you encounter people who feel what has been termed racialized economics. What they feel is that whites are being disadvantaged and other undeserving groups are getting a particular advantage that they have not access to. You go to UW system schools, you interview students, and we do that. We try to recruit students of whom we think that they might belong to our target audience, that these are the kind of people whose behaviors we might want to change. And we ask them, and they say, yes, I feel disadvantaged. I feel as a white person that there are plenty of scholarships that are not available for white people. They're only available for underrepresented ethnic groups. I feel disadvantaged because of this, and I feel disadvantaged because of that. Now, we know that if you look at the numbers, this is actually not true. If you look at all the disadvantages, the discriminations that people of color are facing in their daily lives, that it is not true that white people are disadvantaged. But this is the belief that they start out with, and we have to take that into account and talk to people in a way that opens up the communication rather than talking to them in a way that they perceive as offensive. Because if we do that, immediately the shutters go down, and whatever you say afterwards, it doesn't matter because they're not listening to you anymore. So my suggestion is sometimes start slowly so you can have a communication going. Maybe change these people's behavior. Try to get them to behave more inclusively. Due to that, they may strike up friendships, become friends with people who belong to different ethnic groups. And after they have done that work, maybe then that's when it's time to talk about systemic racism, to talk about the history of this country, etc. And there will be much more openness. So I guess my suggestion would be start slowly and make sure what kind of messages members of the target audience are receptive to, at what stage in their journey, and when they're only at the beginning of the journey, then certain messages may just be too much for them.
Thank you. So we're going to, well, you know what? I had one thing that I wanted to mention to the audience, and it's easy because it's just a simple chart, but I would encourage anybody in our audience to Google Becoming Anti-Racist, and this is by Andrew Ibrahim. That's Andrew Ibrahim, I-B-R-A-H-I-M, Becoming Anti-Racist. And what this will provide you is a graphic look at what he calls the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone. And I think this will help people conceptualize where they may be on that continuum and what the best way for each of the individuals to proceed. Speaking of proceeding, let's move to the next area, and that is our spheres of influence. Sarah, do you have an area that you might say you feel is a way in which you or others might exercise some influence in whatever sphere, circle that you may have, and what could be the most effective way to exercise some influence?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people say, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to start, I like to ask, what are your circles? Are you in a book club? Are you, do you have kids that play soccer? Like where are all your circles? You don't just have one, you have a lot of them. You have a Facebook community online, maybe you have, so write them down. Like this is the work, what we're talking about, right? Like this is you get out a pen and paper and you write down, who am I connected to? Where are my touch points? And what kind of conversations am I missing? Or what kind of opportunities are there for more of these conversations? That's one place I would start. I was having a hard time in the very beginning when people would say, you just have to talk about race more with people, like with your family and friends. And I was like, I seriously don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean just like talk about it? Partly that's because we weren't raised talking about it. Like nobody talked about it. It was bad to talk about it. So I came up with 7 guided conversations, which are super helpful. They're really easy. It's like 15, 20 minutes of prep work. So it's an article, there's a topic, and then there's guided questions. And people have used this in many ways. Some people will do like their neighborhood, and they'll get a couple of friends together and do them to just increase that conversation, and it gets you more comfortable. Like Michelle said, it's a practice, like it's a skill to be able to learn to talk and to be able to learn how to make mistakes and not feel the shame and blame that Marcus was talking about. That's
Thank you. Robin, I want to turn to you because you're a population health expert. And we had some conversation about toxic stress, chronic toxic stress. And I wanted you to take a moment and perhaps enlighten our audience a little bit about that and how that may affect people and what it is that white people can do that may affect that chronic toxic stress that occurs among people of color.
Yeah, so in Wisconsin, we actually have some of the worst health inequities of any state in the whole country. So we have the worst Black infant mortality rate. We're the only state in the country where the life expectancy between Black women and white women, the gap is widening and getting worse. Every other state is getting better. And so what we see with so many different health conditions, from chronic conditions to things like maternal child health, is that really exposure to chronic toxic stress over the life course harms people's health. You know, the way it shows up is through these differences in health outcomes. So I think when we look at the root causes, it turns out that they're not really about access to healthcare. That's a piece of it, certainly access to care and quality of care. But really it's about interactions, so individual experiences of racism and also systemic racism. And so I think looking at our own behaviors and places where we can see things showing up, even those examples that Marcus was giving, I think if people can see where they might be perpetrating racism, whether it's through different types of bias, and noticing that and undoing that, that's one step. But then also figuring out the systems, like Sarah was speaking to, and figuring out ways to change systems so they're not supporting racism.
So I think for many of us in the audience, we may be oblivious to the types of behaviors that we exhibit that create this chronic toxic stress among people of color. Can you give us maybe a couple examples and maybe even some things that you learned in your own work experience?
Yeah, so, you know, the example about implicit bias, I think, is interesting. I had an experience where I took the implicit association test from Harvard and got results that said I had a strong preference for white people. And to me, it was like, this doesn't match my beliefs. This is not what I would think about myself. But then it caused me to notice, do I shake everyone's hand that I meet? How far away do I stand from people? If I'm getting in an elevator, who do I stand next to? So I think paying attention to your own behaviors. The other piece I would say is listen to the people most impacted. So at UW Health and with some of our other health systems, we're doing a lot of maternal and child health work. And when we talked to Black women, they said, you need to acknowledge racism in healthcare. And so we have signed a declaration saying we acknowledge racism as a public health crisis, and we need to do our own work within healthcare to mitigate and minimize bias. So whatever sphere you're in, I think looking at the individual and system level.
Thank you. So I want to take just a minute or two before we kind of wrap up and move to some Q&A. What I called distributing our resources, and see if people on the panel have a suggestion for people in the audience about what is it that somebody can do that could make a big impact, whether it's their giving of their time, their talent, and their resources. Sarah, would you like to go with that one first?
I think it's important to make it something that's systematic, like quarterly or annually. Like is it a percentage, so that you can actually follow and not have to be constantly like, oh, what should I do? And then you're being held accountable to some extent too. I personally support, like I do the research of where I want to support, and Black women-led organizations in Madison. There are a number of them that I am incredibly supportive of. So it's, is that the question you're asking, where or how?
Both.
Both. So I think it's important to get it personal, like make it personal for you. So what are you interested in, and then go seek out the organizations that are supporting that. I personally support Freedom Inc. and Brandy Grayson's Urban Triage, Foundation of Black Women's Wellness. There's a lot. I Centro Hispano, and because it goes all ways. Like, right, if we're just talking Black Lives Matter versus the Centro Hispano. And then how, in terms of financial and time and resources, there's a lot of ways that people can think differently about what they're purchasing on a regular basis. And Black-owned businesses, people of color, like the professionals you hire, is your banker a person of color? Think about it, question everything.
Thank you. You know, Michelle, I want to turn to you because I know that you spend a lot of your time volunteering for various organizations that may be run by people of color, and you extend yourself by just being a volunteer in both giving of your time and your talent, but also creating new relationships and perhaps sustaining the relationships that you already have. Tell us a little bit about what you do, the organizations you volunteer for, that other people could do so once we get past this COVID-19 situation and we do gather again.
Right. And I think this is like the great starting point for people too. So the Urban League has a ton of things you can volunteer for, whether it's our Schools of Hope program, where we need somebody 1 hour a week or 1 hour a day to help with that. Again, we're doing a lot of that online. That's mentoring or tutoring our middle school in our middle school program. You can volunteer at events. Our MLK breakfast that's held at Edgewood High School every year, over 900 people. You get to see the positive stories of some amazing kids in this community, and it restores your faith in youth when you see that. Attend that. You get to see and meet some of the parents and the kids. That's a great way to get embedded in the community. Subscribe to Umoja magazine. It's positive news of the African American community. If you feel like you can't be at a place or whatever, subscribe to something like that where you're learning about what the goodness is that Black people are doing in this community. I'm with a group called Women in Focus. We raise scholarship money for students of color, including returning adult students of color. And it showing up at every one of the Black fraternities and sororities now has galas that they raise money for scholarship. Attend those, support those. You learn about the community that way. Pick up Hughes Magazine. There's a Black Chamber of Commerce. There's a Black Restaurant Week. Support those businesses. That's a way to make a great impact that we have here in the community. And when it's safe, volunteer at your kid's school. Robin talked about the disparities in the health education. You know, when you got here and it was that Race to Equity report, all of our schools, unless you have your child in a certain private school, are pretty well integrated, and you get to learn your kids' friends. They get to learn you. I was known as Zoe's mom for all of her years because we volunteered at her school. So you don't have your own name at that point, but you're your kid's mom. But
You're Zoe's mom.
Yeah, but you get to see them grow up as well, and it's a great way to understand the community too, and to help out our teachers who need it desperately. And so there's a lot of ways to support and get involved at whatever level is comfortable for you. So that's my 2 cents.
You know, I'm going to mention that within the documents that Marcus is going to provide the link to in tomorrow's evaluation, I put together a list of 20 of what I call what white people can do, and I'm just going to mention a couple of them real quick. You could become a big brother or a big sister and mentor a youth. You could attend the Martin Luther King Day celebration that's held every year, one at the state capitol at 10 o'clock in the morning, I believe it is, and another one that's held in the evening at the Overture Center. Help somebody learn to read. Get hooked up with a literacy network. Become a member of a board of directors for a nonprofit organization that primarily supports people of color. As I said, there's a list of 20 different ways in which you could get involved, and I hope you'll look to that list. Well, we're at 8:07 right now, and I promised that we would break at about this time and switch over to our questions and answers. If there are some people who are going to check out right now, I do want to thank the panelists. I want to thank some other people that helped me put this together, Jason and Madeline and Nancy. And I want to thank my wife, Terry, for helping me with everything and being supportive. So as people might check out, I just wanted to say those thank yous before people go. Remind people that we have an evaluation that will be coming out tomorrow. But we will go for another 20 minutes right now and try to plow through as many of the questions that we can get to. So let's see what we have here. I have a question here. Please tell us how we can make a difference. What are we doing wrong, and how can we make changes in our own actions and those around us? That's a pretty broad question, but perhaps somebody might want to take a swing at that question about what people may be doing wrong. I think that's what we fear most, is we're doing something in our behavior that we need to adjust and correct.
I think Sarah gave the answer before, and you wanted to tag Sarah, so go ahead. I think it's not enough to just sit there and be non-racist. I think we have to actively take steps to be anti-racist, in the sense that we have to critically examine how are we passively contributing to systemic racism. And I think there's a lot that can be done. Sarah.
I would follow up also with that by taking steps forward, the next right step, doing one thing and seeing how that goes, you can't do it wrong, because there's no checklist for how to do this. None of us know what we're doing. We all make mistakes all the time. And I think trying to unravel that right versus wrong, because that's what stops us. So anytime I don't want to say something because I think I'm going to say it wrong, or I'm going to do it wrong, that's actually a system of oppression that's holding us back from being able to dismantle the other systems of oppression, because it's the perfection. We're not going to get it perfect. So the first thing I would say, if you want to change your own actions, is that inner self-development work of letting go of that and trusting that if you surround yourself with relationships where people will hold you accountable. We talk a lot about having conversations, but conversations with who? What is your relationship like? And if you can build relationships based on trust and respect, then when you do make a mistake, your people are going to hold you, and they're going to be like, you messed that up. Okay, so now I'm going to repair it. Don't be scared to make mistakes.
Okay, another question is, can any of the panel members speak to the potential ways or resources on how to avoid pushing a person of color to be the token representation of their race or ethnicity or culture? How do you avoid pushing a person of color to be a token representative? I think it's just to be conscious that that could be something, and don't do it.
I don't have deep insights, but more and more companies and university departments are now pushing towards recruiting cohorts of individuals belonging to a specific historically underrepresented groups, because the idea is if you just have one person, they're going to be unhappy and probably going to leave relatively soon. So it's the idea of posse programs that we have at the university, the people program where they come in with their own cohort, and now more and more companies are doing that as well. And then of course, as you just said, is to simply never put a person on the spot and have them be the representative of their group. I mean, it would be highly inappropriate in a team meeting to sort of look at the sole Hispanic person in the room and say, hey, Pablo, can you please give us the Hispanic perspective on this problem? I mean, absolutely inappropriate.
So I have another question here, and I think I know the answer. Are each of you available to do a talk if requested? Do we just need to reach out to you and ask? So I'm going to suggest that Our contact information is going to be available, and you could then contact one of the panelists if you wish to have somebody speak at, well, a virtual event, or God willing, some live event in the future. You have a book there, Marcus. You're muted.
Here, I can't unmute myself. It's somebody put in the chat, hey, the title was incorrect, and what is exactly the name? And here's that book by Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think you mentioned the website, right, Ron?
I mentioned that chart that he's put together.
Yeah, you can just.
I think it's a different person though. I have, but I'm sure that's a good book too. White youth should speak up loud and clear about racism and hate in our communities. How should we motivate them to do that?
They are doing it. We should listen to them.
Our futures with our youth. Is anybody on the panel familiar with Dr. David Camp's work? He advocates whites being compassionate to whites who have overt racist beliefs and actions.
No,
Well,
but I will look that up.
There's a question here that I guess this would be directed to you, Marcus. Do you believe diversity training can work? And maybe you could just touch again on some of the key attributes of the training that does work.
Yes, I saw that question. I thought it was really interesting. Yes, I do believe that diversity training can work. Actually, one of my colleagues here at the university, Dr. Patricia Devine, has developed a diversity training that is highly effective. It treats prejudice as a habit, and we have to break that habit. We all engage in habitual behaviors. It's a routine, and this is what we've always done, and we tend to do it, and we don't monitor our behaviors. In order to break habits, we have to engage in particular strategies to no longer do these habitual actions, and she outlines a series of steps in her diversity training program, how we can go ahead and break that prejudice habit. I think it's a great workshop, and I think it is a program, a diversity training that has been evaluated, and it is effective.
Robin, we have a question here about reaching out to elected officials. And I think you touched on that earlier, that you've been involved in reaching out to elected officials. Can you mention, did you do that by virtue of letter writing? Did you go testify? What were your actions and activities in that regard in reaching out to elected officials?
I would say all of those things. You can send a letter or an email. Certainly they get lots of those. Right now there's a situation going on in terms of funds around a new jail, and I was concerned about that and asked to meet with my county supervisor. I emailed her on Wednesday, and then we had a Zoom coffee on Saturday. So reach out to your elected officials and ask to meet with them, your elders and your supervisors. And then I would say testify. Show up and testify. If it's a school board meeting or a city council meeting, you can testify at meetings and share your voice directly.
Michelle, somebody wanted you to name again the scholarship organization that you mentioned earlier.
Women in Focus.
And they grant scholarships to
Students of color in the greater Madison area, and to returning adult students. And what we found is, I don't know that there is another scholarship that's out there for returning adults. And what we have found, back to Robin's toxic stress thing, we've had people that have had to drop out of college. They started and a parent got ill, a child was ill, they ran out of money, had to quit college for some reason, and now they're ready to come back. It's really hard to find scholarships out there for that. So we saw that as a need, and we have a couple of scholarships for returning adults for that too. Every year we have the I Have a Dream Ball. It's always the Saturday before the Monday of Martin Luther King. it is a funky, cool night. And so that is how we raise our funds. It's an all-volunteer organization, and that's our one big fundraiser a year.
So Sarah, I think this question would be for you. My flight, fight, freeze often kicks in when I witness racism. I default to freeze, which is silence. I don't want my silence to be violence. Any suggestion?
Yes. Noticing it is your first step. So if you are in a situation where you freeze, because I have frozen many times, and then later that night, I'm kicking myself and I'm shaming myself and I feel like I'm the worst person in the whole entire world, which isn't actually very helpful. But if I can reframe that and be like, okay, what could I have said? What would have been helpful? And I maybe even role play that with a friend. Like, what if I would have said this, and talk about it with somebody else? Like, here's what happened today, because that helps process it. The likelihood that next time I'm in the same situation, I will speak up. And it might be clumsy and yucky, but it's that practice. So freeze, and sometimes give yourself a break if you freeze. It depends on what's going on. To be compassionate to ourselves is also, I think, key, because we're pretty hard on ourselves.
So somebody, but I'm not sure who did earlier, may have mentioned the 7 guided conversations.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that was me. That is in the link, or that is in the resources that is being sent out tomorrow, but I will put it in, I'll throw that into that question as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's a question. How do you talk to your white coworkers, neighbors, and family members about getting the city to apply more resources, to take resources from the police and to look at more resources into the communities of color? I guess that's the big issue that we're grappling with right now, both in Madison and around the country. Robin, do you mind, since you're the one who's been most involved in speaking about advocacy, if you might take a swing at that?
Yeah, I think part of it is engaging people and understanding the issues. So I know I've heard lots of white folks say that they don't understand the idea of defund the police, or that's not a good way to frame it. And so I think trying to meet people where they're at, but also follow the leadership of Black people. So Freedom Inc. is doing a lot of education. You can watch M. Adams recorded on Facebook and learn about why this is an issue. And really, it's about investing in the community. It's about redirecting resources to invest. And then I saw someone had a question about the Movement for Black Lives. That's a platform to defund the police. So do some education, but start talking about, what would you support, or what are things that are being done by the police that don't need to be done by the police? What are alternatives for mental health crises? And start having those conversations and engaging people. But I think there are lots of resources out there to do the learning about what the issue is and why this is what's being proposed.
Thank you.
I have an idea for a conversation starter. You can talk to your coworkers or neighbors, and you can have them guess what the wealth gap is between whites and blacks. So for every $100 in wealth held by a white family, how many dollars does a black family have? And we have nearly 200 participants. Maybe they can go ahead and guess. Most people underestimate what that amount is. It actually, the gap is 10 to 1. For every $100 that a white family has, a black family has just $10. So that's the wealth gap in the United States, and that's the wealth gap that we have to address, because we have systematically prevented African Americans from acquiring wealth over several centuries. So I think it's a great conversation starter. Some people don't even think there is a need because they underestimate that wealth gap so drastically. So bringing it up is a great way to start, and why it is important to reduce that wealth gap.
I was going to mention this when Sarah was speaking about real estate business, but one of the facts that I gleaned recently is that here in Madison, let me rephrase that. In the United States, 40% of African American families are homeowners. In Madison, 20% of African American families are homeowners, and I think that speaks to your issue, Marcus, about the lack of the opportunity to to accumulate wealth. Another person, David, and I know this David, he lives in a non-diverse community. Doesn't happen to live here in Madison, but we still have many areas of Madison that are non-diverse. What else could somebody do other than put a Black Lives Matter lawn sign in their lawn? How does somebody relate to that community that may be primarily white and Caucasian? Anybody want to take a swing at that one?
I can offer something. So, I mean, one thing to think about that's coming up here is where you give money. So, and especially thinking about that wealth gap. I think about my family, and I grew up in a working class family. I would even say a poor family, but my grandparents had a house because of the GI Bill. And then, you know, that wealth transfers through families. Or if you just got that stimulus check related to COVID and you're still employed, give it away. Can you give the money to organizations led by people of color? So I think thinking about what you can give away that's unearned is a huge thing people can do no matter where you live. That's one way that you can get started.
And Ron, I'd like to say, excuse me for jumping in, but
yeah, go ahead.
Robin's advocacy earlier too. When I was with my previous employer and we were working on health policy and but mostly around the breast cancer world, it's amazing how little it takes to influence your alder, your senator, your whatever. And they don't like the chain letters that you can just sign your name on and it gets in. And yes, some of that feeds in. If they can hear your personal story, or if they can hear from you specifically, you write your own letter, you give your own call to that office, you can't believe how little it takes to impact that. And it gives them a story as well when they're on the floor or when they're trying to make an argument for a bill or to make a policy change. And we learned that by bringing breast cancer survivors up there. It's just, and if you're somebody that is trying to be a co-conspirator, as Sarah likes to call herself, that's part of it too. Write some letters to whoever is your representative, even though you don't have Black people in your area. Those policies are going to affect our state and what's happening in the state. So you can even get involved at that level too. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Sure. I know that we touched on this before, but I'm going to go at it again. And a question from Julie about how do we distribute our wealth, what organizations right now? And I'm going to tick off a few of them that come to me. I would say that there's the Madison Urban Ministry that just changed its name to Just Dane, is a good organization. Organizations like the Urban League, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, the Black Chamber of Commerce. Somebody also mentioned making sure that you might patronize businesses that are owned by people of color. Anybody else want to offer one or two of their favorite organizations real quick?
I'm gonna say that I've been talking to a number of people about a redistribution reparations fund that Madison desperately needs, and it needs to happen. So there's talk about it. There's nothing that's happened quite yet. I do also want to shout out to this GoFundMe about the Black homeownership, and that is what is, or that specific GoFundMe isn't necessarily like a redistribution fund, but if you just think about mutual aid versus charity and how we're giving money and where we're giving money, and to even be asking these questions, like we might not have all of the answers, that we might be missing things that we could be saying that tomorrow we'll be like, darn it. But if you do in the future start to see something about reparations or redistribution, like check it out, because we need to be doing more of that work, in my opinion, in the city of Madison.
And to that end, too, Sarah, I was going to say the Urban League is doing an amazing job right now of encouraging Black home ownership. We've got this Housing 2.0 initiative where we're buying homes on the South Side to rent, kind of a rent to own type of program. You'll be hearing more about it next week in a big press event that we're going to be doing. But, you know, encouraging organizations and supporting organizations that are doing that work too, and already have the momentum in those spaces.
Yeah, I'd like to just name Freedom Inc., Urban Triage, Foundation for Black Women's Wellness, the Progress Center for Black Women, Centro Hispano. These are all great organizations. The Free the 350 Bail Fund, YWCA are some I would name.
I think we hit many good ones, but probably left a few out. Robin, somebody wants you to take another minute to talk about other examples of chronic toxic stress. Again, some things that those of us in the white community just may be oblivious to.
Yeah, well, sometimes we talk about, you might hear people talk about microaggressions, and I think that's really another way of saying everyday racism. People of color are experiencing things like their coworkers or other people in their building won't talk to them or won't look them in the eye. We actually see with maternal and child health that African American women with a higher level of education have worse birth outcomes. And one of the theories is that it's because they're in workplaces where they're the only person, and so they're experiencing racism from other people. So it can be those one-on-one interactions. It can also be things like have the economic gaps and having less access to resources, the financial stress of what's going on right now. More people of color are likely to be essential workers, and so needing to go to work even during COVID, and the stress of what that's like, exposing yourself and exposing your family and not being able to work from home, or losing your job right now. That's disproportionately happening to people of color. So those situations happening over and over your life course actually take a wear and tear on your body, where people of color age faster because of that exposure to stress in many different forms over your life. And so that really, it actually affects the cellular level of your body and can show up in these health disparities.
So I'm going to wrap up. We're coming up on 8:30, and I'm going to do so by saying this. Some have asked me, why did I do this? And I did it because this is what I know how to do. You can do something yourself based upon what you know how to do. And I think that it's incumbent upon us all to begin the work by doing what it is that you can do and apply it to improving race relations in our life and in the community. I'm going to give credit to Robin. She reminded me about what Arthur Ashe said years ago, a famous African-American tennis player. He said, start where you are and use what you have and do what you can. So I think each of us have our own gifts, and if we do that, again, start where we are, use what we have, and do what we can make a big difference. But we all need to get started and do something, as I said at the very beginning, and try to do it tomorrow. Again, I want to thank our panelists, Michelle, Marcus, Robin, and Sarah. I want to thank Madeline for helping us out tonight with the technology. Jason as well. I want to thank Mark Richardson, who was a confidant of mine in helping put this together. And again, I want to thank my wife, Terry, for being supportive of this endeavor as well. Thank everybody for being a part of this, and everybody have a good evening.